Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'd like to welcome you back to another installment in our social studies video series looking at expansion west and the age of American industry. In this video, we're going to be looking at the ranchers and farmers who would settle in the American West, and the guiding questions I would like you to keep in mind as you watch are: what events led to the settlement of the American West, and what was life like for these settlers? Now, the first industry we're going to be talking about is cattle farming, which came about when longhorn cattle spread into Texas from Mexico during the settlement of the plains in this time period. Now, the markets for these cattle were in the north and east, while the cattle were being raised primarily in Texas. Now, the value of these longhorns would rise from $3 to $40 per head during this time, which led to a boom in this industry. So to take advantage of this rise in prices, these farmers from Texas would drive their cattle north, sometimes over 1,000 miles, to cow towns where the cattle could be loaded onto railroads and shipped to the east. So this was the origin of cattle farming in America during this time. Now, cattle driving was what created the job of a cowboy, which is a very glorified figure in American history. But life for these cowboys was actually very difficult because they typically had to ride for 15 hours per day on cattle drives, and the weather and terrain in which they were working could be very treacherous. In addition, rustlers would try to steal cattle from a herd, which was something that cowboys always had to be aware of. And rivers would pose a particular threat to cattle herds because deep rivers could just wash cattle away completely, while sudden sounds could set off massive stampedes, which were dangerous because cowboys could get trampled. And they required these cowboys to go and wrangle up all of the cattle who had run away, get them back to the herd and back on the drive. So these were some of the challenges that cowboys faced in their work. Now, the value of cattle farming would lead the industry to actually spread north as more and more people began to raise cattle, and building ranches near railroads would eventually replace the practice of cattle driving because it was much more cost effective to have the ranches near railroads because cows would just be transported a short distance to get on a train as opposed to having to drive them so many miles. Now, the cattle prices would boom during the 1880s, particularly the early 1880s, but a bust would soon follow because so many people got involved, and as the number of cattle soared, prices would drop. In addition, there were very cold winters in 1885 and 86 that would kill off many cattle, and the drastic rise in the number of cattle would lead to overgrazing, which would deplete many of the grasslands and lead to situations where there was just not enough food for cattle to survive. So these were a couple other factors that contributed to the fall of the cattle industry after the original boom. Now, in addition to cattle ranching, the other main industry that took place in the Great Plains was farming, even though the Great Plains, the area covered there in blue, did not originally appear suitable for farming. However, the expansion of the railroad made it much easier for farmers to move west, and the land in the Great Plains was much cheaper. So, in addition to these facts, the high rainfall that occurred across the plains in the 1870s spread the belief that farmland could be found in these areas of the Great Plains. So in 1862, Congress would pass the Homestead Act as a means of inspiring people to settle the Great Plains. And under the Homestead Act, settlers would receive 160 acres of land for a very small filing fee, but they had to live on the land for 5 years. So there were many homesteaders who took advantage of this act and settled across the plains with the hope of owning land and becoming independently wealthy by farming. If you think back to our earlier units on the amount of poor farmers who were in America during this time, this was a golden opportunity to own land and become wealthy using these farming skills. Now, these farming families would have to work together because the men in these families would work the fields all the time and would often have to leave to either buy supplies or collect the harvest. This meant that the men were not around the home very often and left women to be the ones who had to care for homes, make clothing and food, and they were also responsible for their children's education. Now, children in these families would often work the fields as well once they were old enough, or do household chores if they were not. But either way, farm life was much more important than a serious education. So skills like reading and writing were still not very common across the plains because children were needed to help out working the farm. So this was how families would work together to try and help make their farms successful. Now, unfortunately, life was often a struggle for these settlers because the climate was incredibly unpredictable. There were periods with very little rainfall, which would lead to droughts that would threaten crops and the lives of these settlers, while other years would bring so much rain that crops were destroyed and washed away and the homes were flooded. So it was very difficult to know what type of season it was going to be for these farmers. In addition, grasshoppers could destroy entire fields of crops because there was not any sort of pesticide developed at this point in time. And harsh winters would bring so much snow that it could actually bury animals and trap families in their houses. So these were just a few of the difficulties that faced these plains settlers. Now, here's some pictures to illustrate just how difficult life could be. In the picture on the left, you can see just how much snowfall there would be and the fact that it could easily cover the people and animals and homes across the plains during this time. The picture on the right shows an example of a dust storm which would occur during drought seasons, which again could threaten homes, destroy crops, and actually kill animals. So just a couple of examples of what life could be like for homesteaders during these difficult times. Now, most areas of the plains did not receive enough rainfall for traditional farming methods, and this meant that the 160-acre plots of the Homestead Act were often too small to make a living on, and unfortunately, many farmers would go into debt or even lose their farms. So another example of an industry that seemed promising but caused a lot of struggle for Americans during this time period. Now, the final area of the plains I want to talk about is the Oklahoma land rush, because Oklahoma was the last part of the plains to be settled, and it had originally been an Indian or Native American territory since 1830. But the expansion of other areas in the plains would pressure Congress into opening the land to homesteaders in 1889. You can see an advertisement there for this great land rush on the right. Now, the official opening day of Oklahoma was April 22nd of 1889, and some 10,000 boomers lined up at the edge of Oklahoma to take advantage of this land boom. That's where they get their name from. Now, a bugler would actually sound a call on his horn for people to rush in and claim their land. But what happened was many Sooners had already slipped into the area and claimed the best plots. Now, this term Sooners refers to the fact that these people acted sooner rather than the boomers, and is so important to Oklahoma history that the University of Oklahoma athletics teams are actually nicknamed the Sooners. So you can see in the pictures on the right the beginning of this land rush and just how many people were involved. Now, by 1890, Congress said that the American frontier had closed because all of the West was now being settled, but this came at a great price to Native Americans. And that's what we're going to be looking at in our next couple videos, just how much of Native American land was sacrificed in the name of settling the American West. Now, we will end the video once more with our guiding questions. If you need to go back and look at certain parts to get your answer, you can do that. And we will be back soon with videos looking at life for Native Americans during this time period. Until next time, this has been Professor Blazek signing off.